But Germany is totally controlled by Russia.
Joe Biden just suggested that Donald Trump wants Russia to invade our allies. In this video, we're going to analyze, is that true? We're also going to analyze Donald Trump's history with NATO and how that could give us some clues in what Donald Trump is trying to accomplish. We're going to look at both sides of the aisle and try to be neutral and unbiased about this. Something that's very important to keep in mind, though, if you are a voter going into 2024. When it comes to Donald Trump, there's something very interesting that can happen inside the Republican Party when you don't find a way to support Donald Trump. Consider this. Do you remember how many Republicans voted to impeach Donald Trump in the House of Representatives after January 6th? The answer is 10. 10 Republicans joined Democrats in voting to impeach Donald Trump. Do you know how many of those Republicans are actually still in Congress? 2. That means, as a Republican, if you voted against Donald Trump, you had about an 80% chance of losing your job. And the only two who kept their jobs were in Washington and California, where some might say there's less Donald Trump support anyway. Now, with that said, let's look at some Donald Trump history when it comes to NATO and negotiating, and then keep this in mind when it comes to the way that Donald Trump can posture himself, because that'll come up when we get to the conclusion. Now, in 2016, Donald Trump, while he was running for office, because remember, he took office in January of 2017. In 2016, when Donald Trump was running for office, Trump said that NATO was obsolete, and he wondered if the investment in NATO was worth it. The United States makes the most substantial commitment to NATO, not only via troops, but also via funding. In 2017, he went as far as declining to affirm Article 5 of NATO. Article 5, of course, is an attack on one, is an attack on all. In 2017, he actually hinted at the fact that we should just pull out of NATO, because why should America defend Montenegro or Germany? So this has been something that went on the first 3 years, really, of President Trump's political career. 2016, when he was campaigning, the first 2 years of his presidency. And then what happened with actual actions? Well, in 2020, we reduced our American troop presence within NATO in Germany. And in 2022, after Donald Trump was no longer president, Donald Trump threatened not to defend NATO allies from Russia following Russia's invasion into Ukraine. The Washington Post suggested that this was really akin to encouraging Russia to go after them. And ultimately, Donald Trump again echoed this idea of, hey, is our NATO investment actually worth it? So this idea of Donald Trump being frustrated with NATO and other people saying, well, Trump is encouraging people to invade other members of NATO, this idea has existed for a while. This is not new, and Donald Trump's frustration has been made exceptionally clear. Now, Donald Trump may have been a contributor to actually pulling off something pretty good for NATO, which we're going to talk about in a moment. First, you have to understand how NATO collects its money. Now, NATO guidelines are usually renewed annually. They're committed to every single year, and they have been since 1950. The usual guideline, although it's not a requirement, there are no HOA dues to be a member of NATO. They're just guidelines. It's kind of like a voluntary HOA, where it's sort of like you live in a neighborhood and they have like a little beach by the pond. And they're like, hey, you know, if you could, it'd be cool if you joined the voluntary HOA and paid $50 a month to help cover some of the costs. It's kind of like that. The reality is there are a lot of people who are like, man, I got enough of my own bills. I'm not contributing, but I'm going to go down to that beach and use it when I want. That's kind of how NATO works, and this is something that has made Donald Trump very frustrated, along with, actually, frankly, many in the international community, just mostly because of the concept of free ridership, this idea that other people could pay and other people could not pay, yet still use. And even though it makes sense to help a struggling allies out when they need help, Donald Trump has really echoed the frustration of, hey, you can't always free ride. At some point, this has to become a debt, and you have to pay your fair share.
The president wants the allies to pay more for defense, saying the U.S. is carrying too much of the burden.
This has been going on for decades. And it's disproportionate and not fair to the taxpayers of the United States. And we're going to make it fair, so that'll be it.
In 2006, a guideline was established that countries should contribute 2% of GDP to defense spending. Now, of course, there's no guarantee that that money will be spent effectively, but there was one rule of thumb, which I wonder, I hate to say it, but I wonder who came up with this rule of thumb. But there is a rule of thumb, and that is that of that 2%, 20% of your spending has to go to, quote, major equipment spending. In other words, if you're going to spend $100 billion on defense every year, at least $20 billion of that needs to go to major equipment spending. Tanks, planes, bombs, Patriot missile defense systems, the latest and greatest stuff. I can only imagine which politically interested parties suggested that. But let's put the jade aside for a moment and just remember that Donald Trump is frustrated about NATO. Donald Trump, by the way, also slammed the Nord Stream 2 pipeline deal. Remember the pipeline that's now half blown up and completely shut down? He suggested that Germany was essentially funneling billions of dollars into Russia and that Germany should not go forward with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline deal, which is really interesting because a lot of people argue that Donald Trump is just trying to help out Russia when he told Germany almost to do the exact opposite.
But Germany is totally controlled by Russia. When Germany makes a massive oil and gas deal with Russia, where you're supposed to be guarding against Russia, and Germany goes out and pays billions and billions of dollars a year to Russia.
Now, I'm going to play what Donald Trump said, but first I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of where people's heads are. Those who are on the left are convinced that Donald Trump is trying to encourage Russia to attack NATO members, that Russia has essentially a puppet in Donald Trump, that Donald Trump will do everything to support Vladimir Putin, and that Donald Trump wants to cause World War III. That is sort of this idea that you get from the left, that, oh my gosh, we could lose NATO. NATO has been a driver of peace. People argue, whatever, right? Losing NATO would be detrimental, whatever. After we listen to these comments, we're going to have to analyze, well, would losing NATO actually be detrimental? There's an argument on both sides. And then, of course, those on the right say, hey, that's Donald Trump's negotiating style. That's just how Donald Trump is, whatever. Let's listen to the comments, and then I'll give you my opinion with what's realistically likely going on. We'll also look at some reactions, and we'll come to a conclusion. Did Donald Trump encourage Russia to attack NATO? Here we go.
We were already into Ukraine for over $200 billion. And they could make a deal with Russia in the next 3 weeks, and all of a sudden they don't want to deal with us anymore. We've given hundreds of billions of dollars. And why are we at over $200 billion? And the European nations are, if you add them up, it's a very similar sized economy. They're at $25 billion. So we're at 200 plus, and it affects them much more. We have a thing called an ocean between us, right? It affects them much more. But we're at 200, they're at 250. I did the same thing with NATO. I got them to pay up. NATO was busted until I came along. I said, everybody's going to pay. They said, well, if we don't pay, are you still going to protect us? I said, absolutely not. They couldn't believe the answer. And everybody, you never saw more money pour in to Secretary General Stoltenberg. Well, I don't know if he is anymore, but he was my biggest fan. He said, all these presidents came in, they'd make a speech, they'd leave, and that was it. And they all owed money, and they wouldn't pay it. I came in, I made a speech, and I said, you got to pay up. They asked me that question. One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills. And the money came flowing in.
Okay, I clearly said the words. I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. So before we come to a conclusion on that, let's understand a realistic, fact-based reality here. Since Donald Trump's aggressive commentary on NATO, defense budgets for allocations to joint defense in Europe over the past 9 years, so since 2015, 2016, when Donald Trump was running, defense budgets have gone up each of the last 9 years. It is entirely possible that could be driven by COVID, economic reasons, geopolitical tensions, Donald Trump, or a little bit of all of them. Realistically, it's probably a bit of all of the things combined. But the reality is defense budgets for NATO countries have gone up consistently for every year in the last 9 years, when that has not been the case in history. Now, what would happen if NATO disappeared tomorrow? Well, we can analyze this in a hypothetical way. First, if NATO disappeared tomorrow, would there be war 2 days from now? Probably not. There probably wouldn't be an instantaneous invasion or sucking up of these other countries, let's say, Finland leaves NATO, even though they just joined, it'd kind of be like, well, what was Finland like before they were part of NATO? Well, not invaded, right? So, but we could make the argument that at the very least, in the very near term, countries that leave NATO, if NATO disappeared, would not instantaneously be invaded. In fact, there is a possibility they might never be invaded by Russia, right? So there's a possibility they never get invaded. There's a possibility they get invaded in 3 days, okay? So the reality is, it could be somewhere in between. It could be, probably never, or it could be, this makes it more likely. In my opinion, what's most likely to happen if you lost NATO, though, is that European countries would have to band together without the United States and figure out, okay, we've got to get serious about our own defensive unity. Maybe it is a European strategic alliance, right? A Euro alliance, whatever. Some kind of essentially new NATO alliance that excludes the United States. That, I'm not saying, is what we want to do, but the threat of that is a negotiation tactic. When Donald Trump was speaking, you have to remember he comes from a real estate mindset. So do I. I have a real estate startup. I'm a real estate broker. I've done real estate for over a decade. I love real estate. And I love sharing financial commentary here on YouTube. I'm a financial advisor, becoming a broker, and stocks is what you name it. But the point is, from a negotiation point of view, it's very powerful to be able to say, you know what, maybe we're done. Maybe y'all just need to make your own union, so to speak, for strategic defenses. And see, last week, the European Union actually passed a pretty big hurdle. They finally got Hungary on board with a $54 billion aid package to Ukraine. However, that package itself gets undermined if you have America say, you know what, we're not contributing at all to Ukraine anymore. And that seems to be where we sit right now. We might not see new money for Ukraine until January of 2025. And there are people on the left who are like, damn it. And there are people on the right who are like, damn it. And then there are people on the left who are like, hell yeah, we'll spend money in America. And then there are people on the right who are like, hell yeah, spend money on America instead, right? So there are people on both sides of this issue. But the point is, the more America's like, well, we're not going to pay, the more you have Europe start questioning, okay, do we want to throw $54 billion at Ukraine if the US is not going to support? So you have a different mindset of how they want to spend money, because your money isn't being amplified by, let's say, a 2x multiplier because of the United States. And you start wondering, okay, well, is this the most valuable way we could spend money? And so that becomes a negotiation tool. Because simply the verbal backing that, yes, the United States will help is actually a really powerful negotiating tool that could help the United States advance its interests. And so there are those who say Donald Trump is just negotiating. There are others who say he's inviting war. In fact, let's go through some specific reactions. Adam Schiff suggested Donald Trump is more interested in aggrandizing himself and pleasing Putin than protecting our allies. NATO suggested any suggestion allies will not defend each other undermines all of our security, including that of the US, and puts American and European soldiers at increased risk. That's actually from Stoltenberg. Europeans who have been interviewed by some of the mainstream media, like the Wall Street Journal, suggest that they remember this interaction a little bit differently. They don't really remember Donald Trump suggesting, oh yeah, I'd encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they need to do. This is where I'll go on a little tangent. I think that Donald Trump probably, back when these negotiations happened, didn't actually say, yes, I would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they need to do if you're delinquent and you don't pay your bills. I do believe Donald Trump said, look, if you don't pay, we don't support. I believe that happened. I don't think Donald Trump back then encouraged Russia to go as far as, yeah, go on, do what you got to do. I don't think that happened. I think that's good for a speech. That's good sort of for like creating drama, which is really great in politics, right? People on both sides got to have their drama because then everybody's talking about it, and then you get more attention. More attention leads to more voting, right? More anger on both sides, more divisiveness. That's how voting works in America. So I think some of this was a little exaggerated from Trump, which will be important for where my opinion comes from in conclusion. The Polish Prime Minister on Sunday said, if Europe does not take a more effective care of its own security, this is their translation, we will make Europe's security depending solely on the goodwill and readiness of the to defend the U.S. Sooner or later, it may end in disaster. Okay, that was a little butchy the way that translation was, but butchered, I guess I should say. But really, what they're arguing is like, hey, look, we maybe need to take our own security into account, because if we just rely on the United States, we might sooner or later end up in disaster. We need to wake up Europe. That was their quote. We need to wake up Europe. You can't only put Europe's security in the hands of the US. That's kind of a good thing. It's kind of a good thing for countries to, maybe we do need to take care of ourselves a little bit here, right? That is not necessarily a bad thing. Certainly, it can be played from either way depending on how you want to negotiate. Now, Nikki Haley said it was a mistake by President Trump to say he would abandon NATO members. And she said that Donald Trump made a mistake to take the side of a thug who kills his opponents. This is a Putin sort of assassination reference. Yeah, Putin probably does do that. She's probably not wrong about that, okay? Wagner did not kill himself, neither did Jeffrey Epstein, but that's a separate video, okay? Yes, Putin is probably a pretty clear and ardent supporter of assassination. That's not a big surprise to anyone. But I don't know that Nikki Haley is really making a clear connection that Donald Trump is purely a supporter of Russia, especially when we consider some of the things he said in the past about wanting Ukraine and Russia to strike a deal.
And I really hope that Russia, because I really believe that President Putin would like to do something, I really hope that you and President Putin get together and can solve your problem. That would be a tremendous achievement. And I know you're trying to do that.
President.
Or, of course, what we saw with the Nord Stream pipeline negotiations. Now, what we ultimately would want is NATO members to support their contributions for what they receive. I think everybody would agree with that. Chris Christie doesn't, but then again, Chris Christie, I mean, you just say the words Chris Christie and you know it's going to be anti-Trump, right? Chris Christie says, well, this is consistent with the love of dictators. Mr. Bolton says the threat of Trump withdrawing from NATO would be very real. And again, I actually agree with that. I actually do think it is a very real threat that Trump would just be like, screw NATO, go make your own little union. And if you really need us, call us up, and then we can negotiate something every time you need us, as opposed to us just always being there for you. It's interesting. Marco Rubio says he doesn't think Trump is inviting Russia to attack. It's not how Marco Rubio viewed the statement. He says he just doesn't talk like a normal politician. Liz Cheney, who's no longer in Congress, she was one of those 10 we talked about earlier, says no sane American president would encourage such an action. Lindsey Graham says, all I could say is while President Trump was president, nobody invaded anybody. It's a good point, too. So, let's get to the conclusion. Joe Biden says, Trump is inviting Russia to attack our allies. Is that true or false? Now, we've gone through a lot of fact, and I've signposted my opinion. I want to get to the conclusion here. I'm going to add some opinion. Based on the whole context, and I mean to the extent that you can get context in a 20-minute video, based on the context we talked about here, I don't think, personally, that Donald Trump is inviting Russia to attack our allies. I do think Trump is doing the classic negotiation tactic, hey, pay up or you're getting evicted. I think that's the angle he was coming from. He's trying to come from a position of negotiating power and show his constituents that he's a strong negotiator. Now, people on the other side look at Donald Trump and say, no, man, he's a loose cannon. He's going to cause war. But then again, Lindsey Graham's comment isn't necessarily wrong. All I can say is, while Trump was president, nobody invaded anybody. So there's a balancing act here. Now, that's not to say if Donald Trump didn't have his second term, he wouldn't have had to deal with inflation or Israel or Ukraine. A lot of people say he wouldn't have had to. But it's an interesting balancing act that it's worth considering. So, my big bottom line from all of this, no, I don't think Donald Trump is like, hey, Putin, go kick Germany's ass. But I do think Donald Trump is coming from the angle of, Germany, you better start picking up. Because I told you not to deal with Russia. I told you not to do the Nord Stream deal. You didn't listen. Now it's time for y'all to start paying up a little bit more. And I'm not saying they haven't been contributing to Ukraine and NATO. You know, of course, Germany is a contributor. I'm just saying, this is the way I took this away. And do I really think Donald Trump is trying to suck up to Putin and Biden is right in saying that Donald Trump wants Putin to invade other countries? No. Is there a real threat that NATO will be extinguished and something else will form? Yeah. Do I think that's going to lead to instantaneous war? No. Absolutely not. In fact, it probably just lead to...
Why not advertise these things that you told us here? I feel like nobody else knows about this.
We'll try a little advertising and see how it goes.
Congratulations, man. You have done so much. People love you. People look up to you.
Kevin Paffrath there, financial analyst and YouTuber. Meet Kevin. Always great to get your take.